The salt air hit them first, thick enough to taste. Nya stopped at the threshold, her hand hovering over the weathered wood of the door. Beside her, Taro, En, and Millie stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the dark interior of the Fisher Lair. The shack groaned under the relentless pressure of the coastal wind, a low, rhythmic creaking that sounded like a warning. They were here for the work, and the work was already waiting. Nya pushed. The door swung inward with a heavy, protesting scrape against the floorboards. A wall of brine and damp heat rushed out to meet them, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of raw seafood. Inside, the space was dim, illuminated only by the flickering orange glow of the massive stove. Shady stood at the center, a silhouette against the steam, surrounded by crates overflowing with the morning catch. The group did not hesitate. They stepped across the threshold, the floorboards vibrating beneath their boots. The transition from the open coast to the cramped, humid air of the shack was absolute. They moved into their positions, the weight of the day settling onto their shoulders. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing the group within the walls of the Fisher Lair. Nya moved first. She reached the massive iron stove in 2 strides, her hand finding the gas dial with practiced precision. A sharp click echoed, followed by the roar of blue flames licking the underside of the heavy iron skillets. The air temperature spiked instantly. She grabbed a crate of lobsters, the shells clattering against the wood, and tipped them into the searing metal. The sound was immediate, a violent, high-pitched hiss that filled the room. Steam billowed upward, carrying the scent of salt and searing fat. Nya did not look back. She grabbed handfuls of clams and oysters, tossing them into the pans with a rhythmic clatter that set the pace for the entire room. Millie darted between the prep tables, her movements sharp and efficient as she cleared space for the incoming plates. Shady stood at the center, watching the burners, her hands moving to adjust the heat as the pans began to smoke. The kitchen transformed from a silent workspace into a frantic, high-pressure engine. Nya flipped a crab, the shell crackling under the heat, and the sound of the cooking surged, drowning out the distant roar of the surf outside. The chaos was absolute. Taro and En burst through the shack door, the sudden transition from the humid kitchen to the harsh, open air hitting them like a physical weight. They did not pause. They sprinted across the weathered planks toward the edge of the pier, their boots thudding against the wood in a frantic, uneven rhythm. The surf below was churning, a chaotic mess of foam and dark water. Just as Taro reached for his gear, a violent gust of wind tore across the harbor, nearly sweeping him off his feet. He slammed his shoulder against a wooden piling, his fingers locking onto the rough surface to steady himself. En surged forward, grabbing the heavy coils of line before they could be whipped away by the gale. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, bracing against the spray. Without a word, they cast their lines into the deep, the weighted hook slicing through the surface with a clean, sharp sound. The lines went taut instantly. They began to haul, their muscles straining against the sudden, heavy resistance of the catch. Hand over hand, they pulled, the rope burning against their palms. As they fought to replenish the dwindling supply, the pier vibrated under their feet, the wood groaning in sympathy with the tension of the lines. The lunch rush faded into a rhythmic hum of cleanup. Shady wiped the last of the brine from the counter, tossed the rag into a bucket, and gestured toward the harbor. Nya, Taro, En, and Millie moved as one, leaving the heat of the kitchen for the sharp, biting air of the docks. They stepped onto the deck of the fishing vessel, the wood groaning under their combined weight. The hull shifted, settling deep into the water with a heavy, rhythmic creak. Shady climbed to the helm and turned the ignition key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died, leaving them in a sudden, jarring silence. She cursed, slammed her hand against the dashboard, and cranked it again. This time, the motor roared to life, vibrating through the floorboards, and rattling the fishing gear stored in the stern. The boat lurched forward, the lines holding them to the pier snapping taut before being cast off. They pulled away from the safety of the dock, the gap between the wood and the hull widening with every rotation of the propeller. The shack shrank into a small weathered box against the horizon. Ahead, the water turned from a murky harbor green to a deep, restless blue. They stood at the gunwales, watching the land disappear, the vessel cutting through the swells. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence was absolute. The boat drifted, its momentum carrying it into the center of a swirling, ink-black patch of sea. The water here moved differently, coiling in slow, heavy eddies that slapped against the hull. Shady stood at the gunwale, her hand extended, pointing toward the center of the vortex. "A rare fish lurks down there," she shouted, her voice barely cutting through the rising wind. The team moved to the rails. The air temperature dropped, the salt spray turning cold against their skin. Nia gripped the railing, her knuckles white as she watched the water churn. There was no sign of life, only a deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to vibrate through the deck plates. Taro and En uncoiled the heavy lines, their movements deliberate and cautious. They dropped the weighted hooks into the dark, the ropes hissing as they vanished beneath the surface. The lines did not slacken. They went rigid, vibrating with a tension that felt less like a catch and more like a warning. Millie braced her feet against the shifting deck. The boat groaned, tilting slightly as something unseen pulled at the lines from far below. The wind howled, whipping the surface into a frenzy, but the team did not move. The water did not just break, it exploded. A massive, shimmering shape surged upward, its scales catching the harsh sunlight like shards of jagged steel. The force of the breach slammed against the hull, sending the vessel into a violent, sickening roll. Water cascaded over the gunwales, flooding the deck and knocking the gear crates loose. Taro stumbled, his feet sliding across the wet wood, and lunged for the railing to keep from going overboard. Nya hit the deck hard, her hands scrambling for purchase as the boat pitched at a sharp, dangerous angle. The line in her grip went rigid, vibrating with a power that threatened to pull her arms from their sockets. Shady fought the helm, her weight thrown against the wheel. The beast thrashed, its tail slapping the surface with the sound of a cannon blast, sending spray flying in every direction. Millie grabbed a support beam, her knuckles white, as she watched the creature circle the stern. The deck tilted again, throwing them all toward the port side. They scrambled to regain their balance, their muscles straining against the erratic, powerful movements of the vessel. The fight was no longer a hunt, it was a desperate battle for stability. The boat shuddered as the creature dived, its massive weight pulling the stern deep into the churning wake. Nya braced her boots against the gunwale, the fishing rod bent into a sharp, dangerous arc. Her arms burned with the strain, every muscle fiber screaming as the line hummed with tension. Taro scrambled to the edge, his hands gripping a heavy, iron-tipped spear. He waited for the shimmer to break the surface again. En threw the thick, braided rope, looping it around a rusted cleat to anchor the boat against the creature's relentless pull. When the beast breached, Taro thrust the spear, his shoulders locking as he drove the point into the thick, armored scales. Millie grabbed the secondary line, her weight thrown back to keep the rope from snapping. They fought for an hour, their bodies slick with sweat and salt. Finally, the creature's movement slowed, its massive form drifting alongside the vessel. The line went slack, the beast finally ceasing its struggle. The sun dipped low, painting the harbor in long, bruised shadows as the vessel scraped against the pier. They hauled the massive ketch onto the dock, their movements heavy and deliberate. Every muscle in their shoulders throbbed with the residual tension of the fight. They dragged the crate into the shack, the floorboards groaning under the weight. Before they could even catch their breath, the door swung open. A wave of customers flooded the room, their voices rising in a chaotic hum. The team exchanged a single, silent look. There was no time to rest. Nya grabbed the heavy iron skillet, the burner clicking as it flared to life. Taro and En began scaling the fish, their knives working with rhythmic, practiced precision. Millie moved between the tables, her footsteps light and rapid, punching orders into the register with a steady, metallic click. The air filled with the sharp, savory scent of searing meat and hot oil. The exhaustion that had weighed them down moments ago began to dissolve. replaced by the familiar, mechanical momentum of the rush. They worked in a seamless, silent loop, plating the fresh catch and clearing tables. The last guest pushed through the door, the bell chiming a final, hollow note that echoed against the cooling walls. One by one, the burners clicked off, leaving only the low hum of the refrigerator. Taro and En slumped onto the wooden benches, their hands still stained from the day's work. Millie wiped the counter with slow, rhythmic strokes, the rag dragging across the surface. Nya stood at the basin, the water running cold over her wrists. She picked up the final plate, scrubbing away the last traces of grease and salt. Her movements were heavy, deliberate, and slow. The adrenaline that had fueled the dinner rush finally ebbed, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache. She set the plate in the rack, dried her hands on a towel, and turned to face the center of the room. The silence was absolute. She walked toward the center, her boots clicking on the floorboards, and stopped just inches from the lens. She leaned in, her gaze steady and tired, the lines around her eyes deepening in the dim light. "That was a long day," she said, her voice low and raspy. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle between her and the viewer. "Do you like eating fish? Tell me, what is your favorite food?"